Govan, a community with a proud industrial past, now facing both challenges and opportunities. Once a hub of shipbuilding and manufacturing, the area has seen mass depopulation, but its role in Glasgow's future remains crucial.
We launched this study with the aim of gaining a better understanding of Govan's housing needs to help steer, to help guide strategic planning and investment decisions with the aim of maximising benefits for the entire community. With the support of Glasgow City Council and 3 locally based housing associations, we're aiming to build a strategic plan. With the support of Glasgow's GRID programme, we are accessing Govan's unique assets with a view to maximising employment opportunities, housing options and connectivity, with the aim of improving life for Glasgow's residents.
1 in 10 people within the Glasgow City region work within the Govan area, and that will be enhanced by the Health Innovation Hub in the Glasgow University, basing itself within the Govan area too. And we think that there's bound to be impacts on the local housing systems, and this research will help us to be at the forefront of trying to influence the changes that happen within the area.
Key to Govan's future is its housing. With rising demand for social and private housing, this study is exploring a mix of housing options, social, mid-market rentals and student accommodation, tailored to the local community.
Govan's an interesting place. It might be at a pivotal moment with the new bridge and investment going into the Glasgow Riverside Innovation District. Some of the changes underway might get accelerated in terms of attracting students into the area, but also there's opportunities for helping the existing population, young people, to be able to stay within the area by offering them housing which could meet their needs and demand. Following this study, we see there's an opportunity for it to be able to influence Glasgow's next local development plan, which is currently being prepared. Within Glasgow's Strategic Housing Investment Plan, we've set out Govan as a key strategic spatial priority. But one of the key things we want to do is to build on the existing partnership working that we've carried out through this project, to further engage with the community and to look at ways that we can continue to work together to better shape the future for Govan.
There was an attempt initially to help at subnational levels to target housing investment more efficiently by understanding what was going on in local housing sectors or systems. And this framework for a decade was the statutory evidence base for local housing strategies across Scotland. We actually exported it also to Wales and to Northern Ireland. And I've probably personally spent 20 years training people to undertake local housing systems analysis, as well as undertaking it in different places. But what it's basically about is applying systems thinking to that kind of local housing investment evidence base, and applying a little bit of applied economics and some hopefully robust empirical social sciences, and also recognizing that reality is incomplete and imperfect, and we have to triangulate different data sets, make judgments, use qualitative research, etc., to try to make the most of the evidence that's available. And typically, local housing systems analysis operates at a broad area level, travel to work area, metropolitan region, something like that. So it was rarely ever developed at the level of a local authority or below, which makes this project so unique and interesting. And essentially what we tried to do was we tried to think about what were the drivers of a local housing system, what was outside the housing system that shaped what happened within it, and then to look really closely at the system itself. And you might do that by tenure or by house price distribution or whatever. And ultimately, you want to assess what are the imbalances in the system, which are serious, that they require further investment or intervention. So about a year and a half ago, we got into discussion with Matt and with the 3 community-based housing associations in Govan, and asked us if we might like to undertake a local housing systems analysis of the Govan area on the western edge of the south side of Glasgow. And I guess this was because we all thought that on inspection, and the kind of intuition of the thing was that there was a sense of a tipping point, an opportunity here to not just understand the needs and requirements of the local area in terms of social housing and the needs of households, unmet needs, but also to understand the opportunities that the lands and the situation and the economy offered to generate, for instance, private housing as well as social housing, and also mid-market, and also potentially student housing as well. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and I'm sure we're going to talk about some of the reasons behind that. But we undertook a scoping study, a data audit, a number of those sorts of things, as well as interviewing a number of local experts and collecting as much secondary data as we could to help fill the gaps, as it were, of the knowledge. And I think there were a number of key takeaway messages I would take from the research as a whole, just in 3 or 4 sentences. First, that we were told by somebody, one of our key informants, that Govan's transformation required a seed or a spark, a catalyst to make it come into fruition. But and we think the evidence suggests that that's right, that there is this great opportunity. The bridge is one-dimensional, but that's what we're kind of majoring on in some ways here. But it's also the connectivity of public transport and private transport as well as the developmental opportunity. But all of that needs leadership, and it's been clear throughout that strategic regeneration works where there's clear leadership and a strategy, and it can be actually applied. And we think that we can learn from success stories in Glasgow, like the Gorbals, like Sighthill, but also about what doesn't work. And I think people in Govan themselves know from previous regeneration episodes what works and what doesn't work. So there needs to be that combination of citywide learning and wider learning, but also the local knowledge. And we also found that Govan is a very open system. It's an incredibly well-defined local area. It's got natural barriers of rivers and motorways and the hospital and such like, and the local authority boundary. But actually it's very open to the economy. It's a very big part of the Glasgow economy. It's an important part, but it's still an open system, which means that from a local housing systems analysis, it's actually quite hard to distinguish between what's been driven at the city level and what's happening at the local level, and they clearly interact. And one of the things that we found when looking at the needs, particularly of the 3 community-based housing associations, is that there's an important question about city-level housing need being expressed in the Govan area, as well as Govan's portfolio of property, the turnover of the stock, the waiting lists growing for other reasons, etc. But that have that twin set of issues going on, which kind of runs through everything that we did. So the only other thing I'd like to say, just for a finish, is that does it make sense to do this, to do this analysis at the local scale? So as I say, it's clearly the case that Govan is exposed to wider influences on spending, investment, on the housing market, and footfall in terms of people's retail decisions. So it's not a standalone housing market area. No one's pretending it is. But we shouldn't disregard the value of that kind of deep dive and kind of examination of what's going on in the Govan area and what the potential is. So I think one of the unique distinctive features of our work is the land audit that Gareth James carried out, because it's given us a really rich sense of both the kind of detailed empirical knowledge, but also the intuition of what the local people say is possible in the land area there. And one really interesting point was made by somebody, which is about it's not just simply finding land for housing, it's finding the balance of housing for land, housing for local economic development, and sustaining the that are possible in the Govan economy. So we think that this is a worthwhile approach. It's a replicable approach and could be worked with other parts in Glasgow, but it does beg the question about the complementary value that a broader city region kind of level analysis would have, which would inform us. My very final sentence, if that's okay, Nick, is that we felt we were a little bit hamstrung by the unfortunate timing of the census, because that is in many ways the alpha and omega of the data that we would use in this process. And we only got at the very end of the process, in the last few weeks, did we actually get access to usable current census data. So any further local analysis will obviously get the benefit of that, as well as hopefully the lessons that we've learned from doing this work. I think I'll stop there.
That was fantastic, Ken. Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful introduction to local housing system analysis, its background, how it was applied here. And it was also nice to hear that there are important limitations just given the sort of scale and scope. And that leads me into asking Matt, can you tell us perhaps a little bit about what you had hoped the cash research might achieve, and what challenges and opportunities that you believe exist for Govan?
Thanks, Nicholas, and thanks for Ken for that introduction and background. It's probably good to talk a little bit about the origins of the project. Ken mentioned there that we approached Ken about a year and a half ago. The kind of idea for the project probably started. It's good to have David Bookbinder here, who's director of Glasgow West of Scotland Forum. It's actually at their conference in summer 2022 on community wealth building that it happened upon a workshop run by Irene and Gary, who is the chief executive of Elder Park House Association, who were talking about the partnership work they'd done in Govan, working together across the 3 local housing associations, including Govan House Association as well, in response to COVID and lockdown, and like some of the major challenges around supporting their tenants and residents and their communities, really, by working together, pooling resources, knowledge, experience, and connections as well, those connections to the community. And hearing the passion they were talking about, and the evidence of clear partnership working, we got to talking, and it was clear that we all had this, as Ken referenced, this idea that something interesting was happening in Govan right now. We knew that there was the major infrastructure investment going in terms of the bridge. And so that was an interesting conversation. I thought it'd be useful to kind of explore that a bit more in terms of what our understandings were about Govan. So initially it was just our conversation. What do we think is happening in Govan in relation to some of these things that are happening? At the same time, we'd started work preparing our next local housing strategy, 5-year main statutory strategic plan for housing in the city. We knew that place was going to be an important feature of that, but we weren't quite sure at that point how that was going to be integrated within the local housing strategy. And as everyone probably knows, Glasgow is a major city. It's at the heart of a metropolitan city region that Ken talked about there. It's a complex place. It's dynamic. There's not one particular type. It's a mishmash of localized housing systems and markets. And the local housing strategy at that level has to try and deal with that at the city level. But we knew that we also needed to try and we had to do that. We also had to try and get a better understanding of what was happening in different places. And Glasgow, through the work of Professor Brian Evans and the Place Commission, we knew that we've got a reputation in terms of housing-led regeneration. Some of the examples that have been mentioned there in terms of the Gorbals and the transformational regeneration at Sight Hill. So there's already been projects and work, Clyde Gateway being another. And we knew that these types of approaches had worked and there were lessons to be learned. And it felt like maybe that there's something interesting happening in Govan that could potentially benefit from that kind of local level of analysis that could fit in within the housing strategy. And so that was really the hope, that we could maybe apply a solid, coherent framework to gathering our evidence and understanding, our shared evidence and understanding of what's happened in the area. So we approached Ken, and that was when the idea of applying a local housing systems analysis approach at this level, which, as I mentioned, hadn't been done before, to see if that could provide us with additional insights and understanding which would help us to better steer future strategic investment opportunities, particularly for housing, and hopefully then be able to influence some of the changes which are already underway. I think it's important to emphasise, Govan wasn't sort of selected as an experimental area where we're going to do something to it. It's an acknowledgement that things were already happening. Govan is a very interesting place. It's got an incredible amount of history and assets, not least its community-based housing associations, but its cultural heritage, and its and as Irene mentioned in the video there, the importance in terms of the economy and as a major destination for people who are seeking employment. So yeah, that was our hope, that through this study what we would get would be a deeper understanding of the dynamics within this localized area, and also an approach and method that we could then take and apply to other areas as well. You asked about challenges and opportunities. I suppose in terms of the actual study itself, Ken outlined those that Govan, it's quite a well-defined geographical area. It's bounded by the river and the motorway, but it is also it's a very open economic system. So it's a lot of the challenges are the challenges that face the city itself in terms of external drivers, affordability, cost of living pressures, inflation, and I suppose a particular issue for any kind of understanding of local housing, a very localized housing system, is mobility of need and demand. How do you try and contain that as well when people are free to choose, free to move around, and so on. But there's also some very internal things as well, I suppose, that as with other areas, Govan has its challenges in terms of its legacies of past industrial legacy, and in terms of its stewardship and its safeguarding of existing housing, that requires maintenance to invest in, and there's particular challenges around ensuring that the existing housing can continue to function well to meet housing needs and demand. So yeah, in terms of it's not just all about new housing and new investments. It's about how do we retain and preserve and safeguard what we already have, so it can continue to serve the needs of the communities and serve new needs as well as they may arise. But yeah, the reason why Govan was an area of interest now to look at was because of the opportunities as well. And these are concrete things that are within Govan as well, like the new infrastructure that is going in. Govan is a well-served multimodal transport area. It's got subways, it's got bus interchanges, it's got the motorway connections as well. It's got business and industry located there. It's got well-established housing associations, not just the 3 local housing associations. There are other providers, regional, national specialist providers as well. And the land, there's opportunity in terms of developable potential within Govan of land. One of the things that will probably jump out if anyone who reads a study is, Govan at its peak of population had over 150,000 people. It's now got, we think, just less than 30,000. So it's suffered a huge depopulation. But as you could imagine, that previous population will have had the infrastructure, built environments to support that to an extent, and that has changed, but there's capacity to regrow some of that in relation to Govan's future as well. So these are all major opportunities for the area as well, and that was our real hopes, was through this study and understanding we would have a chance to be able to better influence change for the area that's already underway, and we could do that together in partnership as well, working collaboratively across both the local authority, the housing associations, and the university as well, through the Glasgow Riverside Innovation District.
Thank you, Matt. I mean, that was fantastic. I think the points that you made about investment work, strategic undertakings already been in place and already being in process there in Govan is really important. And as you're saying, you're highlighting the opportunities that exist for the variety of reasons. There's a lot of infrastructure that's pre-existing, connectivity, etc. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Irene, so as we sort of said in your brief introduction, 38 years in social housing, that's incredible. We know that the history of Govan is inextricably linked to the history of community-controlled housing associations. So that is going to obviously be an enormously important role into the future. So perhaps you can tell us what role you see for community-controlled housing associations in ensuring that the local residents are included in and benefit from Govan's future strategy.
Thanks very much. I believe that community-controlled housing associations are really agile, vibrant catalysts for housing change at a very grassroots local level, very connected to our local communities. Govan has a really interesting, rich cultural, political and social history, and it developed around the pre-1919 tenements where thousands came to work in the shipyards, and the tenements were created to house those people. And just going back to history a wee bit, going back to 1971, like a brilliant young architect, Raymond Young, got together with some determined Govanites in 1971 to challenge the planning wisdom of the time of clearing people out of Govan and moving them into brand new housing estates. And they had, in the context they were working in at that time, they created this unique new model of community-based housing association to really focused initially on saving the tenements, and actually unique in that offered both community control and community ownership of these assets. There was really friendly legislation at the time with the Housing Scotland Act 1974, right levels of grant funding, a really supportive national agency in the Housing Corporation that wanted to develop housing associations and have tenants and owners in control. And the best thing about the model for me is it had motivated, trusted and enthusiastic local people wanting to resolve their own housing issues with a bit of support. Now, turn the clock forward and we're in 2024. The Scottish Government and Glasgow City Council are now looking again at the future of the Glasgow tenements and how we can extend their lives. Linthouse has actually spent, by the end of 2025, we'll have invested 19.5 million in 750 tenements that we have in our area. But we're working at a very different time where there's no friendly national housing agency, there's no clear grant funding regime, there's a very harsh economic environment, and we're also currently trying to work really hard in partnership with both Scottish Government and Glasgow City Council to address national housing emergencies. So a lot of our core tenant base are focused on some of Maslow's lower needs of shelter, warmth, food, but there are leaders within the community that can take on big issues and really get involved. Deindustrialisation had a terrible impact in Govan with the decline of the shipyards, really from World War II right on to the kind of mid 70s, early 80s. And efforts to transform Govan over the last 15 years have had all sorts of different labels. There was housing action areas, areas of priority treatment, transformational regeneration areas. And now I'm really glad that Matt, as our strategist in the city, is telling us that Govan will be a key spatial priority area. And really, my job as one of the CEOs is to work out what does that mean for our organisations and how can we get the best for the local community. So how I actually see the housing associations influencing this is the three CEOs in Govan felt there's not a coherent strategy here. We're not a TRA. There's no one strategic organisation leading on this geographic area, and that's why we go in partnership with Matt at Glasgow City Council the university, who are about to create a world-class health innovation hub next to the biggest hospital in Western Europe. The local community was a bit stung when Queen Elizabeth Hospital came to Linthouse, because all of the other hospitals that were cleared in the West End and the South Side were in much higher value land areas than the Queen Elizabeth, and the community felt excluded from any decisions, so it was sort of landing on us. We actually feel now that the university and Grid have got like an opportunity to do this in a very different way, and actually involve the community and work in partnership with us. And we, the three housing CEOs, have been working from the very beginning with Grid, because we see the transformation from the traditional industries of shipbuilding to the creation of a health innovation district is something that the local community could be really proud of. But
I mean, you're mentioning some really important points there about sometimes the disjuncture, I guess, between some of the larger policy imperatives and then the sort of contact at the ground level. I definitely want to pick some of those up with you when we get into some further questions, but I might just open it up to David, bookbinder, just to say some of the things that have already been discussed about the future opportunities of Govan and the way that this strategy in the report was laid out. Based on your reading of the report, David, what lessons do you feel could potentially be applied to other parts of Glasgow, and how might those be applied?
Yeah, well, the how is an interesting one. I think the overriding message from me for this is that the utter common sense of looking at sub areas, and there Govan. I mean, I think Matt said, well, no area, including Govan, is completely self-contained or an island in itself. Of course, it's part of the wider city, but I suppose the key attraction for me, and I'm sure other members in other, on the webinar or otherwise hear about this work, is that you go back. I mean, I can remember about 20 years ago, Ken will put me right on this, where there was a need and demand study across Scotland, and it was found that Glasgow, and I think this was, if I'm not being unfair to Heriot Watt, I think it was a Glenn Bramley study at Heriot Watt for the Scottish Government, which found that Glasgow had no net housing need. And I think, although whether this falls into the category of urban myth or not, I think Professor Bramley was heard to say at some kind of seminar that, well, if you're looking for a house in Partick, you just need to go and live in Easterhouse, and it kind of showed that sort of nonsense of, sometimes when you look at a whole city area, and especially one as large as Glasgow, it just in some ways makes no sense, because people that are looking for housing, in one particular area want to live, or do live and want to stay living in a particular area, are not really going to be that interested in totally unfamiliar areas. And it might be worth throwing in that I think there is a sort of synergy here, this local approach with what may happen in the future. And I know this is a painful area for everyone to think about, but in terms of access to housing and common housing registers, it's never going to happen citywide. It just won't work. It needs to be on a local level, and this is where that there is scope, I think, for one part of the excellent joint working that's already going on with the housing associations and the council, is to look at that kind of access to housing, even if it's just a single sort of registration point. I think other associations across the city will be looking enviously at how this particular piece of work has developed in terms of just using that knowledge, the incredible knowledge and understanding that comes from the community-based associations. They probably don't think of themselves as master planners. They probably see that as a sort of local authority sort of function. But my God, that what can be fed in, and in this case by the three working in harmony, is is just immeasurable. I would say just I think just a couple of other comments from the report. I agree. I think it's really optimistic that, compared with, if you're looking at this at some other parts of Scotland, there's no land. If you're looking at Edinburgh, for instance, there is land, of course, in Govan. That's been made very clear. I really, really hope that, that can be capitalised on for the right balance of housing, and that the current bombing of the programme, the Scottish Government's programme, which is building at the moment at about 40% of the rate it would need to build to get to 110,000. I mean, that's dead in the water. But Glasgow itself, as a local authority, is doing its damnedest to keep the programme going. But that is I hope that doesn't get in the way, because that again is not great timing when we're in a bit of a severe dip in the programme. And finally, I think just the other, Irene, as Irene always would remind us of the whole tenemental issue. And again, I think Glasgow, more than a lot of other local authorities, truly does understand the headaches and challenges that mixed tenure throws up. And some people you're talking about, the most topical part of that is retrofit. I wouldn't overestimate. I mean, the report talks about the potential opportunities that can come from building a sort of industry around, and jobs around retrofit. I think we have to take a step back and sort of build that industry around doing up tenements, let alone retrofit. I think it's roofs and stonework, and I think Glasgow really understands that. But the mixed tenure issue that needs a Scottish Government approach about supporting owners and getting that balance between carrot and stick. It's going to be a big issue, and Govan, almost more than any other area, it's a huge issue. But we've got a fighting chance, because the council and the associations truly understand that mixed tenure headache.
And I think you're quite right to point that out. I suppose you mentioned both the question of access to housing and mixed tenures, and that really sort of makes me think, when we were doing the research, one of the sort of key aspects that came out was the tenure distribution, and the impact that tenure distribution had on Govan. And so I'd like to throw it over to Ken. Tell us a little bit about the tenure distribution across Govan and how this impacts strategic options for Govan's redevelopment.
Well, I think the key thing here is that it's that kind of invisible mixed tenure that you get in the tenements. And one of the things we've not talked about yet is the interest that the community-based associations have in the acquisition of private rented properties where it makes sense, where it works, and that's an important way where you can on balance, you can increase affordable supply that way. It's not always the case that's a one-for-one improvement. You might be effectively, it depends really who was the previous tenant and what's their circumstances, etc. But that is an important thing. And again, it's where that local knowledge and expertise is really, really important. I think what was striking was we found, to the extent that we can see these things, we can see that there's real potential for first-time buyers in potential in Govan, and the bridges are really important to that. We can also see that there's potential for some other tenures that are not maybe as obvious, and one of those, for instance, might be a bigger investment in student accommodation as part of the university's interest. Both of those things can work if they can be affordable relative to the kind of city average prices, that they can work in that sense. And I think that's what's behind part of the planned investments at Ibrox for the TRA Transforming Communities site there. The other thing that's striking is that the private rents I think they're low relative to the Glasgow average, but they're obviously rising strongly as they are everywhere else. And that's another example where the rental market kind of reflects city pressures in the same way that social housing need reflects city pressures as well at the margin, as it were. But I think nothing that we've found doesn't suggest that as was said by David, if we get the strategic use of land right, and there's a great opportunity to actually develop in a place where, whereas it might be much more difficult across major parts of Scotland, this is a no-brainer in a sense from a social housing investment point of view. It just seems to me to be of the relative trajectories you could look at. This is the one that seems to work. But and the other thing it says, I think the points made about distinguishing the retrofit from the basic improvements required in the stock, those things definitely go together. And it's a bit like what we've talked about elsewhere about the sort of fabric first ideas. They're rooted in the basic amenity value of the stock, and so that's really important. And so I think those ideas about jobs for construction maintenance full stop are really helpful.
Yeah, so I think, you mention acquisitions and redevelopments and opportunities for different types of construction, potentially, mid-market constructions for first home buyers or whatever rentals might be the case. This really raises a question of zoning, land use. And so it says it behooves me to ask Matt, what role do you think the zoning and land use across Govan has in promoting, or has had in promoting, the challenges to its development, and what role might the council play in unlocking these potentials?
Thanks, Nicholas. Well, I think obviously it determines what's possible, how land is zoned, obviously, and Govan, due to its kind of its previous major industrial past, it has a legacy which is maybe doesn't fit in terms of if you were to kind of start it from scratch, you might not have the things located where they're located, but they will have been over time attempts to introduce things on in through different phases of programs and investment and attempts at regeneration as well. I think that would be one of the challenges and that's maybe one of the things around trying to look at Govan at that Govan-wide level, is that when projects are considered at a project basis or a kind of a lower level basis, decisions might be made which didn't take into account wider impacts. So you end up with a kind of patchwork of features within a local area, which in of themselves at the time may have made sense, but when you consider them now, perhaps you would say, well, does that make sense having this type of light industry located here next to this type of development? But they would have been driven potentially by opportunity and availability of resources at the time and so on. So I think it's a bit around maybe understanding that things done with the best of intentions may not necessarily yield optimal results, but there's always opportunities to reconsider, to look again, and that was some of the things that Ken's mentioned. One of the things mentioned in the video we short start is that Glasgow City Council, as other local authorities are, is under preparing its next city development plan. That's a major process and new types of local development plans following the Planning Act and National Planning Framework. That these are important statutory strategic documents which set out potential for future land use, and there's a major opportunity through this study to influence that and local place planning as well. So I see that as being a key opportunity that this study comes at the right time to be part of that in that bigger conversation around what's happening within Glasgow. But I'll maybe go back to some of the points picked up from David and Ken there about the dynamics of change and new and different types of existing challenges, but new and different types of challenges. I think one of the things that's also a challenge for Govan is we know that compared to other areas, that potentially housing and rents are maybe not as high as other areas, but it's a speed of change that can happen in areas. I think that was always going to be one of the concerns. There's no one pathway, no one trajectory necessarily for how you might wish to influence change in an area, but to some extent it's about understanding that without a steer, things can happen. The speed of change can be such the volatility can have displacement effects. It can have unintended consequences. I think that would be some of the concerns around, Govan taking off. There's always that potential that people can get left behind, and it's understanding those dynamics. So I suppose the local housing systems analysis at its core isn't about a master plan or a blueprint. It's diagnostic. It's understanding the existing balance within the system and what you could influence and how those interact and what you could influence in order to help steer the things that might happen in the future as well, some of the growth potential. And we can see the potential, the flagship development at Water Row, the mid-market rent development on the south bank of the Govan and Partick Bridge. If Karen from Govan House Social here, she would tell you that that they could have filled that 3 times over in terms of the demand for that. Likewise, there's major demand for the new award-winning local housing developments that have taken place through the community housing associations as well. The Jim Stephen House conversion to student accommodation is hugely popular as well, indicative of the potential demand for new types of accommodation within the area as well. So it's clear from the study there's that potential there, and it's, I suppose, the opportunity for influencing that through the study, through the local development plan preparation will be critical. But coming back to that point of Ken around and Irene around having that level of leadership and partnership, that I think will be key.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, you raised this issue of people potentially being displaced or left behind, which was, I know from the very beginning of our initial scoping interviews, this was forefront in our minds when we were doing all of this, initial data gathering, because it's quite clear there are stark contrasts, and Govan is an area with very high levels of deprivation from the local population and so on. And this is obviously, whatever strategy is implemented, you want to make sure that it is equitable and that there are shared and evenly distributed benefits. And I suppose Irene, as being in some sense a custodian of large populations of people who potentially might be displaced or would be potentially if anyone is going to be left behind, it would be the sort of people that are, that you are dealing with on a regular basis. So I suppose, again, I ask you, how, from the report and how the study was undertaken, how do you see your role, community-controlled housing associations, in ensuring that there really isn't this left behind scenario and people being displaced?
I think one of the things that the 3 CEOs were interested in was different forms of tenure, as well as the social housing tenure that we have at the moment. And one of the big issues for Govan is that there are areas of land, but none of it is in City Council ownership, apart from the TRA and Ibrox. So we've got a whole load of different folk that we need to work with, to get a coherent strategy. I don't think our tenants will be left behind, because anything that we do as an organisation is focused on benefits for the tenants. So we recently developed, 2 years ago, we developed an award-winning development at Cromdale Square for circa 11 million. That's now being used as part security for a 7.5 million loan that will get reinvested in the tenements for windows energy efficiency measures, which will make life more comfortable. But the kind of point I was trying to make, that Govan has been through all of these different housing action areas, different things. For the first time, Govanites, the combined assets of the 3 housing associations in Govan in terms of our land and building is lands and buildings is 282 million. Our annual turnover is 24 million, and our borrowing capacity is 100 million for the 3 of us together. So we should form an attractive partnership, and our partner to others to breathe new life into Govan. And the people that might get left behind are really our core customers, and they are at the heart of like everything that we do. So if we were to expand greatly, it would need to somehow benefit our existing customers. We're doing acquisitions in partnership with the council just now for Section 5 referrals. They help our financial bottom line to address the highest level of housing need in terms of homelessness. And by helping our financial bottom line, that actually helps our customers. So the best thing about community controlled housing associations is local people in control of significant assets, and they actually set the strategies. And one of the things they want to do is like improve the life chances of like local people by raising their aspirations. And I think bringing the university, and if we get a vibrant university district in the area, that will really help to raise local aspirations. So I think, I don't know if anything Matthew would want to add to that.
No, I think it's, yeah, that really comes, I think, yeah, we're absolutely assured of the role of the community-based housing associations. I think in terms of looking after your existing tenants and your customers, I think maybe picking up on what Ken, I think more around the wider rental sector and understanding that potential. I mean, that's probably one of the most dynamic elements within any local housing system, is how the private rented sector functions and how that kind of moves in between tenures as well, kind of converts into own occupation or is acquired for an alternative social rent tenure. And there's dynamics behind that, and that's maybe where government might see some of the bigger changes in terms of how the private rented sectors adapts to some of the changing environments in terms of students and the growth in terms of the health innovation campus and so on. So I mean, that's part of the wide challenge. But yeah, I think that's governed in terms of its existing assets and its existing organisations. That's what gives it a basis for influencing that as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Matt. I think we're in the last sort of 8 or so minutes of the seminar, so I think I'll pose a question to David, and then I think we'll just finish up with some final comments from Ken. So I thought, in your reading of the report, David, was there anything in particular that surprised you, or that you upon the reading of the findings, that you were actually quite surprised to see that was the case with respect to Govan?
This might be a bit left field, but one of the things, and it's just been mentioned by Matt, quite a curious sort of about turn that in relation to what appears to be an acknowledged need to extend, or to in fact start from scratch with student housing, as being, the sense that is part of a normal community. And why I'm struggling, I'm not struggling to get my head around it, but I suppose I throw in a word of caution on that, because I do completely see that, you want, there's so much that a proper mixed and balanced area, which includes students living in all types of accommodation, including purpose-built accommodation, brings. But there are parts of Glasgow, and there are certainly parts of places like Edinburgh, where it's become the only development. And I would just want to sort of throw in a kind of, a word of caution about not getting to that position where almost it certainly happens in parts of Edinburgh, where every vacant piece of land goes to student accommodation. That is another area of getting the balance right. And I mean, to be fair, what I've heard from Matt and others, I don't fear that will, that you get that wrong. It just was quite weird to hear people say we need more student accommodation, because if you look at Partick and not, and some other areas, it feels like it's become the dominant form of new provision. So as with the whole report, it's just about balance.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. Obviously, about balance, and you can't overemphasize any one particular strategic option or direction. And I think this is a nice lead back into where we started, which is the conversation about local housing system analysis, because systems thinking by its very nature is holistic. So you are trying to understand the system, even at this local level, as a whole. And I think we can go to Ken then and just get on the basis of this. Yeah, what would be your sort of key takeaways about Govan as a system? So which sort of elements are interacting most significantly to produce the outcomes that we're seeing at the moment?
Thanks, Nick. I think it's an interesting dynamic that is apparent. There are new partnerships. We've talked around them this morning, but clearly there are big players in the form of the NHS, BAE, the university, who are now they have a footprint which is significant. It's very significant for some of them, and the university, it seems to me, is the dynamic growing one of the three, which offers potential for changing the composition of government, for changing what's possible, and that includes its housing. And I think that's why leadership is so important. So the two things that I can come away with is actually the importance that Govan has for the Glasgow housing system, which we've kind of thought of this the other way around. And I've been focusing on this sort of citywide drivers on Govan, but home ownership and home ownership development is problematic everywhere in the UK, and it has been for a long time. And the opportunity to inject home ownership, but at the same time to inject genuinely additional social housing at Ibrox, etc., is important and can be a catalyst for other social housing development and market development. Can become more attractive because of that. So that's really important, I think, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And also, it's an opportunity for things like the private rented sector and new forms of rental housing. But just to go back to what David was just saying, I think what's, from a Glasgow-wide point of view, I kind of, there is some efforts at the moment to develop student housing in Rockhill. Actually, that's ongoing just now. There's planning permission being sought for that, which is what you might call pretty radically off city centre. But similarly, if you were making developments like that in Govan, closer to the bridge, then that's really important for Partick and those sorts of areas where there's now a kind of red line around student housing. And I think there's genuine worry in Glasgow as well as there is in Edinburgh about the shape of the volume of planning permissions going forward in the city centre for student housing. So something which is, commutable and walkable to the main campus of the university, and which one would expect to be slightly more affordable. I think that's quite important in offsetting some of the pressures in the city centre going forward. So there's a city benefit for that, as well as the notion of how it changes the community, how it changes the composition of people, the kind of jobs that are available and the opportunities that are available. So there's a really interesting dynamic, but it has to be led, it has to be coordinated and be strategic, and the partners that we've mentioned all have to play the role within it. So we're left, just to finish off, we're left with this kind of two-way relationship where the city impacts on Govan, but Govan has opportunities to actually be beneficial to the city as a whole, not just to support its community.
Yeah, I think thank you, Ken. That's a really, really comforting and heartful way to sort of finish the note on this, and sort of shows that it's an iterative process. The research in Govan reflects on the research to wider Glasgow and vice versa, and there are lessons to be learned that can be broadly applied. And I think that really highlights the value of this study and the report that Cash has produced. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining our seminar and our panel discussion today. If anyone hasn't yet received or read the report, feel free to contact Cash. You can contact either Glenn at Cash, myself, Nicholas Harrington, or Ken, and we'll be very happy to discuss the report further with you. But I'd like to thank our panelists, Ken Gibb, Matt McNulty, Irene McFarlane, and David Bookbinder. If you have any other questions, feel free to email us. Cash is always at your disposal. And thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.